Welcome to Gabfest Reads. I'm John Dickerson. For this episode, our book is The Notebook, a history of thinking on paper by Roland Allen. Of course, I'm doing a book about notebooks. But this book is about so much more than about notebooks. It's about thought as it progressed through the history of human understanding. It's a history of creativity. It's also just a wonderful tour through the way in which we capture these ideas that come into our heads. And I'm delighted to have Roland Allen with us here. And so we're going to jump right in. I have to tell you my origin story before I ask you yours. Ryan Holiday, the writer who writes about Stoicism, posted some of the books he'd been reading recently, and yours was in the stack. And I sent him a note and I said, did you like it? And he said, absolutely. So I ordered it right away and dove in and absolutely loved it. And so I wanted to tell people about that because it was just a great entry point to the book. You know, I don't know Ryan at all, but that kind of recommendation was just great. So let's set off here. What is your origin story with the idea? When did you decide and why did you decide to think about writing about notebooks and taking really hold of the world from that perspective?
Well, it goes back, I suppose, to when I first started writing a diary, which was, I think, 22 years ago. I was adult. I was about 26 at the time. And I started doing that because I discovered or come by several of my grandfather's pre-war diaries, which were completely fascinating and were from a completely different world. Tiny, tiny little things, but so evocative in terms of bringing to life this guy who I'd hardly known, my grandfather. And so I was quite inspired by this, and I started keeping my own diary over the years and got really into it. Every year I'd write a bit more, and I started using diaries for different things, as sketchbooks, for keeping lists, for keeping records of books I'd read, and so on. And then I just became generally curious in other people's notebooks as well, and I started noticing one big reveal, I suppose, was that people who I really admired at work in book publishing, who were the most creative, who were the most effective, who were the people who were best to work with, always carried their notebook around, whether it was what you would call a legal pad or a Wiro pad or an expensive moleskin, didn't seem to matter. And then I was made redundant. And so I had a bit of time on my hands. And for the first time, I asked myself, where did notebooks come from? Which I thought would be a really simple, easy question. And then I could find out, and then I could get on with my day. And here we are 5 years later. So I think I got to the bottom of it. But what was interesting, what was really set me off down the road of writing a book about it was finding out that the origin of the notebook coincided with all of these really interesting other events in the world, movements in the world, and then realizing that actually the two were connected, that there was some causality there as well as some correlation.
That, to me, was one of the great surprises and what made it such a galloping read, which was that basically I found myself pretty quickly realizing that I was, in a way, walking through a history of knowledge, of creativity. You know, at one point you can imagine, and maybe I did, the notebook as being a place you captured existing knowledge. But then all of a sudden I started seeing the way in which forms and approaches to the world change because a notebook is available to you. I'm thinking, for example, the way you write about the ability to have a sketchbook or study painting. Explain for people, without giving too much away, how the technology of the notebook or the sketchbook changes or affects the way painting and representation takes place.
Okay, so writing this book, I guess, turned me into a bit of a historian. I don't want to call myself a historian formally, but it was a skill I had to pick up because I found out that the first notebooks in Europe, and it is mostly a European story I tell, and you can date them quite precisely. They turn up in about 1250, 1260, and the place where they really take off is in central Italy near Florence. This is actually a corner of economic history where I found this out, because what I found out was that they were being used by merchants and bankers, or merchants who became bankers because they had loads of money, in order to do the things which we now call bookkeeping. They were literally keeping the books. And I guess one of the big eye-opening moments for me was reading a very short paper about the history of accountancy, which pointed out that the 7 principles by which all accountancy works to this day, things like credit and debits, accounting period, accounting unit, the accounting entity, all of these things first came together in the year 1300 in companies formed in Florence. And this is quite telling anyway, because these are the first companies in the world, first financial entities that weren't people or the church. Okay, so that's interesting. So notebooks were very much connected to bookkeeping, and because I've worked in business all my life, I spent most of my life in Excel spreadsheets, it seems to me. And this became very relevant. And then I thought, okay, this is interesting. What else was happening in Florence around the year 1300? And I knew nothing about it. But then in literature, you have Dante, who's just about to start sort of peaking in his literary career. You have Giotto, who is the artist who, I didn't know this, but everyone said is the big progenitor of the Renaissance. Turns out he is. And you have lots of other little sort of, or not little, but huge innovations going on. And Florence in 1300 suddenly went from being this area of complete ignorance to me to the most exciting moment in time, because you have this economic activity. If you look at a notebook like technology, you start to think of it as something analogous to a computer. People are using it in different ways. It's hardware, but people are bringing their own software to it. And then you have this amazing literature coming out with Dante, but then Boccaccio and Petrarch. And then you have the art. And I knew a little bit about art because I'd worked a good deal with people who teach art, making books with them. So I knew that the one thing you have to do if you want to learn how to paint is draw a lot. That's the one thing that they will all say. You have to draw, and you have to draw a lot. And I guess that is where you see some causality, I think, because I think it's really hard to draw. Having a notebook or a sketchbook lets you draw so much more than not.
Yeah, and you quote David Hockney, who says basically that it's not enough to just look at a work if you're an artist. You have to copy it, make it your own through the process to really get it into your bones, which I believe also about notebook keeping for thoughts and notes and your own thinking, which is proved by some of the other writers that you write about here who had notebooks. When I read about the connection that you discover and that you tell so well between bookkeeping and then basically the ledgers that grow into notebooks that then become a vehicle for self-expression, it reminded me of the early days of the computer, which I covered as a journalist. Computers were created for essentially spreadsheets. And then at the early edge of what was at the time called multimedia, I remember interviewing somebody, and I can't remember, Esther Dyson or something, who said, where this will really blossom is when people use these things that were created for business as vehicles for self-expression. And now, of course, we live with influencers and social media, but this would have been in the mid-90s. So that was all a future, but it felt like exactly the same thing. There was sort of this killer app, these ledger books that then, go off in this other direction.
You're exactly right. And I think that the analogy really holds up very well. And particularly when you feed in the international connections, which you see in Florence at the time, because they were directly dealing with places as far afield as what is now Syria and North Yorkshire in England, and even the Baltic. So they're very, very widely internationally connected. They're very cosmopolitan as well, which makes me think of the Silicon Valley situation, harvesting talent from around the world. And there is a lot of money sloshing around. They get fantastically rich, some of those merchants, to the point where they're sort of bankrolling the King of England, so he can go to war. The Bardi family in Florence famously paid for several English campaigns in France. And this isn't my thought alone. It's definitely a connection which occurred to me. But when I was speaking to one of the historians of paper who I interviewed in writing the book, she also drew quite separately the same connection. She was delighted by it. Oh, yes, Silicon Valley. And, it clearly was a really exciting moment in time with this new technology, which they were all, really keen on.
Let's go back to your grandfather's diary. When did you find them? What period did they cover? And were they little jottings down, or were they deep, plumbing of his inner life in these diaries?
Oh, well, that's interesting questions. So I guess I came into them indirectly after he died when I was about 6. And then his wife, my grandmother, died sort of more than 10 years after that. And I guess they must have been in a box, which we must have taken in at some point after she died, when I was just about my late teens. And then they sat in a box. And then a few years later, I opened them and found them. And they're these tiny little things, maybe 4 inches by 3 inches, leather covered. And they cover the years 1938, 1939, and 1940. And for me, having an interest in history, full stop, obviously 39, 40 were sort of interesting times. But then there was also this very interesting other context, which was he was British Danish or English Danish. He grew up in London, but he had very strong connections to the Baltic Sea. And when he wrote those diaries, he was actually living in what is now Lithuania. So he was living overseas, which I'd done myself as a young man. And he had this really interesting life. He was clearly very gregarious, very sociable, probably by today's standards, completely alcoholic. He had a sort of series of fairly casual girlfriends who he wrote about a little bit. And he was also very much involved in international business. His job was he managed shipping. So he would fill up ships in Lithuania, which would then export things like eggs or timber to the UK. And I was working in business myself, so I found everything very interesting, essentially. And what was interesting was he didn't seem to have a particular filter. He didn't write long, detailed entries for each day, but he wrote about his girlfriends, and he wrote sort of gossipy things about his colleagues and the films he saw and what he ate and the time he lost his hat. But there was also just a lot of really mundane stuff about the times of day that the ships were arriving and leaving. This was very important to him, so he kept a good track of it. There was one moment where he complains for several days of, first it's a hangover, then it's pain in his stomach, then it's a really increasingly bad pain in his stomach, and then he vanishes. Turns out that it was appendicitis. And so 6 weeks later, the diary comes back to life, if you like. There's these 6 blank spreads. And he starts recounting the whole story of his appendicitis and how he must very nearly have died. And a lot of these things actually then became a bit more poignant because I was looking into the names he mentioned and the places he mentioned. While he was living in Lithuania, it was occupied by Nazi Germany, which is a little historical corner which I had no idea of. It's up there with the Sudetenland and the occupation of Poland, but no one knows about it. So he was living for a while in occupied Europe, and a lot of the people, and I think certainly at least one of his girlfriends was Jewish, and sort of looking into what might have happened to the doctors who looked after him when he had appendicitis or the people he was seeing. It's unfortunately, turned into some no conclusive answers, but nothing good, I think. So that sort of added these very casual notes that he'd made about their lives, sort of some kind of real emotional weight for me, looking at these little details and snippets.
Because they are just snippets and it's not all colored in every possible corner. Did you find yourself inhabiting the empty spaces? In other words, you're imagining what's happening to him during the times that the diary drops off.
Yeah, exactly. And also you sort of look for other little bits of evidence. He seems to have written the diary when he got back home every night. And so when he writes about having stayed out drinking with his friends until 3 a.m., the handwriting is definitely quite loose. Yeah. On a normal evening, it's different. It's quite small and tight. So then you can tell sort of by inference at other moments when he is writing when he's drunk or very excited or stressed, or just by looking at the handwriting, that there's this, again, little unintentionally revealing thing when he's on the ship home. He catches a boat home in July 1939, so about 6 weeks before war starts. And the ship is routed through the Kiel Canal, which runs through northern Germany. And so for one night, he is sailing literally through Nazi Germany. Everyone knows that war's about to kick off, and it could be at any moment. And his handwriting for that entry is very big, very loose. He clearly stayed up all night, watching Germany roll past him under the prow and probably nursing a big schnapps.
Let's go back to the narrative quickly. I want to ask about the lowering of the cost of paper is a huge turning point in this story. Explain why that is.
So if you wanted to write anything down before paper turns up in Europe, which is around 1250 for the sake of argument, You basically either have to do it on a wax tablet, and everyone had these little wax tablets. Very few of them survived. They'd gone back to even before what we call the classical era. There were examples which are thousands of years old. Little bits of wood with a layer of wax on them, and with a stylus you would scratch in your note. Now, there are obviously disadvantages to that. They're very small. They're not permanent at all. You can't make anything like a contract on a wax tablet unless you then lock it up somehow. Okay, so what if you want to write something more permanently? Then you have to write on parchment or vellum. And those are great as writing materials. They're almost indestructible. You can make them anywhere where you have wild animals. And the church in particular was very, very fond of parchment. You do have as well papyrus. Papyrus is very impractical, essentially because it falls apart very, very quickly. So if you want anything permanent at all, you have to write on parchment. But it's really expensive because from one whole animal, you get maybe, I'm going to say about 8 pages worth of useful parchment. So when paper comes along, it's made out of literally old linen undergarments, which are pulped up. It was also made out of fresh linen, but I think a big part of it was just taking people's old rags door to door and pulping them into paper. And one paper workshop a day can make thousands of sheets, as opposed to a skilled parchment maker who can maybe make 2 or 3 if he's lucky, and if the weather is nice and warm and the parchment dries out for him nicely. So the difference between the scales of the industries, I think it must have immediately been very dramatic. And I'm no historian of paper, and there are a lot of historians of paper, will put any kind of fixed price differential on it. And they say, well, sometimes it was cheap and sometimes it was expensive, and it depends on, the parchment maker you had down the road. And of course it did. But what you do see very quickly is big paper books, notebooks appearing with the kind of people who would never have had a parchment book. So in Florence, going back to Florence this time, the average will, so from someone who could have been a cobbler or a tanner or a builder, not from an aristocrat, the average will includes 2 or 3 books in the 14th century. So essentially that means there's a book in every household, at least. And there's no way that could have happened if they were all parchment. There just wouldn't have been the money, and there wouldn't have been enough animals to provide all those hides. So paper really revolutionizes things. The other thing is that if you have a contract on parchment, you have to take great care of it, because you can scratch writing off parchment very easily and then replace it. So parchment is very easily forgeable, which is great if you're making an illuminated manuscript, because it means if you make a boob, you can go back, scratch it off, start again. But if you're trying to do a contract or anything in business, parchment is fatal. Whereas paper, you write on that in ink and it's there, it's permanent, no one can argue with it.
This episode is brought to you by ZBiotics. Let's face it, after a night with drinks, it's tough to bounce back the next day. You have to make a choice. You can either have a great night or a great next day. ZBiotics is a surefire way to wake up feeling fresh after a night of drinking. ZBiotics pre-alcohol probiotic drink is the world's first genetically engineered probiotic. It was invented by PhD scientists to tackle rough mornings after drinking. Here's how it works. When you drink, alcohol gets converted into a toxic byproduct in the gut. It's this byproduct, not dehydration, that's to blame for your rough next day. ZBiotics produces an enzyme to break this byproduct down. Just remember to make ZBiotics your first drink of the night, drink responsibly, and you'll feel your best tomorrow. Go to zbiotics.com/slate to get 15% off your first order when you use SLATE at checkout. ZBiotics is backed with 100% money-back guarantee, so if you're unsatisfied for any reason, they'll refund your money, no questions asked. Remember to head to zbiotics.com/slate and use the code SLATE at checkout for 15% off.
Hello, it is Ryan, and we could all use an extra bright spot in our day, couldn't we? Just to make up for things like sitting in traffic, doing the dishes, counting your steps, all the mundane stuff. That is why I'm such a big fan of Chumba Casino. Chumba Casino has all your favorite social casino-style games that you can play for free anytime, anywhere with daily bonuses. So sign up now at ChumbaCasino.com. That's ChumbaCasino.com.
Sponsored by Chumba Casino. No purchase necessary. VGW Group. Void where prohibited by law. 18+. Terms and conditions apply.
I'm David Remnick, host of the New Yorker Radio Hour. There's nothing like finding a story you can really sink into that lets you tune out the noise and focus on what matters. In print or here on the podcast, The New Yorker brings you thoughtfulness and depth and even humor that you can't find anywhere else. So please join me every week for the New Yorker Radio Hour, wherever you listen to podcasts.
Do you see a story of when notebooks become locations for personal revelation? Because they're quite practical, aren't they? I mean, you know, you're drawing the water for the drilling process. You're keeping your logbook on a ship. You're keeping figures in the double book accounting. Is there a storyline about how you get from the first place that a person can write down their innermost thoughts to what we conceive of as journals and diaries now, which are more the location for our sort of personal exploration? How do you see that story going?
There's one big question at the heart of it, which no one's ever answered, which is why people who were using notebooks all the time for hundreds of years, in Italy, for instance, but also Germany, France, everywhere in Europe, for hundreds of years, no one keeps what we think of as a personal diary. So when I go home tonight, I'm going to write a diary about our conversation, about my journey to work, about how I feel, about, you know, the argument I have with so-and-so, and how I feel about it. And that's normal for me, and it's not an unusual thing to do. But it took people a long time to think of it. This, what we think of as a really simple idea. They didn't do it in Florence at all. They didn't do it in France or Germany. It seems to have started in rural England around the 1560s, and which partly fills my heart with joy because some innovation actually happens in England. So it was nice to bring the story back there. But why it happens, I really struggle to put my finger on a reason why. And interestingly, the real historians of the diary, who tend to be French, who also locate it there, they really struggle as well. They can't find anything particularly unusual about England in the 1550s, 1560s. It was not particularly turbulent. There was religious tension, but there was religious tension everywhere. People were reading and writing much more. Ditto, all over Europe they were. Who knows? What I love is that you immediately see this same mixture of things which, for instance, I saw centuries later in my grandfather's diary, which are in my diary, which are this mixture of big global events, the weather, an argument you had with your neighbor, the king dies, and then I'm not getting on with my wife or my husband, you know, and this, particularly that marital difficulties, like nearly every time you read a diary, someone else's diary, you'll come across that. And that's a golden thread which runs through that story. So it's quite common by 1600 or so in England. And we know this because you have the play, there's a play written, Volpone, by Ben Jonson, in which two of the characters talk about diaries and one of them reads the other's diary out on stage. So you have that horrible, emotionally naked feeling of having your feelings displayed in public. Awful. By 1600, and that's happening on stage. So by then, everyone knows what a diary is in England, but absolutely not the case in Europe. It spreads over the following century or so.
When you talked about the writing of the big events and the tiny little events of the day, I was thinking of, isn't it so that the Great Fire of London, one of the accounts of it is in Samuel Pepys's diary, who he would write for days, as I recall, about, you know, went to the Privy Council and then went and had my morning draft, and then like the sort of basic, boring logbook of the day. And then suddenly there's this account of watching London burn, which I first came across in a book of great accounts of London at various different periods. So Dickens and so forth. So here you have a great account that comes just from one of these diaries you're talking about. And that's, Pepys is in the middle of 17th century. So it's a little later than where this idea started.
Yeah. So he's fantastic because not only is he a compulsive diary taker with absolutely no filter. So he writes it all, you know, and he's pleasantly human. Like, he does bad things and he regrets them. He's clearly a great bloke to know. He has loads and loads of friends. They're constantly singing and playing music round at his house. There's a lot of wine and women and song. But he's also right at the heart of government, if you like. He's one of the leading civil servants of his day. When he gets to deal with the Duke of York, it's a big event for him, but it does happen. So he's right at the top of English society or British society, as well as being this compulsive diary writer. So yeah, his account of the Great Fire is terrific, and the details in it are fantastic. You can track the whole, because he was so well informed and he was there while decisions were being made about, are we going to blow up these houses before they burn down? Are we going to pull houses down to make fire breaks? He was there for those conversations. And then he also says, and then I raced off in order to bury my Parmesan cheese in the back garden. So in case the house burns down, at least my cheese will survive.
Yeah. He also, I mean, what I loved, to your point about the wine, women, and song, as I recall, there were periods where he would sort of go to work in the morning, and then he would have then he would play and drink in the middle of the day, and then he'd go to church, and then he'd go back to work again. Like the day, as it's described by him, was just crazy.
Yeah, it was. He very much, they didn't have that, or he certainly didn't have that rigorous division. His time was pretty much his own. He was also, almost as an aside, he was a really, really good administrator. He sort of revolutionized the Royal Navy. So people would be writing about him even now, even if he hadn't kept the diary. So, yeah, he had, and he went to the theatre as well. He's a really good source on the theatre of the period. He went and saw trials and wrote about, people being tried for murder and things like that. He had a really rich life.
How do you see the story evolving with the writers? So, I mean, I love the Mark Twain notebook that had, was it 3 layers so that he could write notes about his travels and then rip out the page? It was like I had a mimeograph sheet.
Well, he wrote travel journals, which is a long, great tradition in its own right. So, and being Mark Twain, of course, his travel journals are really worth reading. But I think presumably in order to make publication easier, actually, I'm thinking aloud, but he wrote in these patent notebooks which had a carbon paper sheet in them so that every entry you made, you ended up with 2 copies, as you say. And then he would post one back, I think, to his wife, once he'd had a few days, once he had an entry, and whether or not, they were then used for publication, I don't know. But it's a lovely way of sort of sharing your experience with people without destroying your diary, which is obviously no one wants to do that.
What interested me there was the role that these notebooks play with Hemingway and Twain and Patricia Highsmith. Are they places where they're working out ideas? Do they represent the husks of an idea? In other words, they kind of start something in the notebook and then it becomes fully realized? Or is it 1,000 flowers bloom? I mean, in other words, all kinds of creative writing types use notebooks in various different ways.
I think the latter. If you look, for instance, at, I think the most hyper-organized one was Virginia Woolf, who I came across, and she had multiple projects on the go always. So she was an author, she published, as in she was a publisher. She wrote book reviews constantly for the Times Literary Supplement, and every project she had its own dedicated notebook. If a thought popped into her mind, she would grab the right notebook and use it, and then she would draft all of her novels in longhand in different notebooks, and those all survive. And interestingly, I've sort of learned from that. Now I still write books, and I've started keeping very organized notebooks. So if I'm thinking, okay, this is an idea for chapter 5, I get the chapter 5 notebook and I stick it in the ideas part of that notebook. And then there are other parts which have got paragraphs that have, written up in more detail, or interviews or notes or things I've seen. So I've become more organized, inspired by people like Virginia Woolf. At the other end of the scale, you have Agatha Christie, who was just absolutely chaotic with notebooks. I mean, it's the only way to describe it. She would write down anything, anywhere. And she had about 5 or 6 on the go at once. One must have been down the back of the sofa. One was in her purse. One was, on the kitchen table. And patching together, there's a guy who's done it. And I tip my hat to him because it was no small job. Patching together how her books came together from the notes across all of these notebooks was a real job in retrospect. But it's fascinating because you can see how much effort she put into making those books work as well as they do. I think they're little clockwork marvels, and she really thought them through. She thought them through in a way which looked incredibly chaotic, but then the result is so polished and incredibly readable.
Yeah, and that's what also intrigues me is the how much writers go back to them. I mean, Joan Didion, as you quote her in her essay on keeping a notebook, talks about finding meaning in those notebooks when she's feeling not very creative in whatever she's doing at the moment. They become prompts for the work that she does.
She uses an image a bit like paying forward, doesn't she? She says, oh, if I put it in the notebook now, in years to come, I can cash it in with interest and get a story out of it, get a picture out of it.
Yes. How do you use your notebooks, and has it changed? You mentioned becoming more organized. Has it changed over the years that you've done one? And are we talking about something that sits on the table, or are you carrying it with you, or are you got multiple pieces of technology?
There's the main one is my diary, which I try and keep every day, and that comes everywhere with me. And I'm a bit neurotic about that. And it becomes, in a way, a bit of a comfort blanket. And then that has lots of ideas and sort of snippets written down in it. So there's always somewhere, if something occurs to me, I can always just write it down or make a list. And that applies to creative things, or just, oh yeah, I need to get some onions, or I need to call my mother, And then, as I said, I've got more and more involved with, as I think a lot of writers do actually. Patricia Highsmith also really organized her notebook thinking. She had parallel sets of notebooks on different writerly topics. Going further back in time, Francis Bacon, the great English essayist in the late 16th century, he had, at one point he sits down and counts them up, and he has 28 separate notebooks on the go. If I was to compare myself to him, I'm currently working on a different project, and that involves 6 notebooks all for one project, and I'm going to fill them all up, and then they will all have sequels. So that'll turn into a stack. And then I have another one which I just keep talking points for moments like this, for interviews like this. And then there's another one for meetings and interviews and things like that. So yeah, it's quite a stack.
And now, as we come close to the end, I'll admit my own practice, which has been before I went to spend a summer studying at Oxford. When I was 19, I got a notebook at the local drugstore, and I've carried one in my back pocket ever since. And so over my shoulder, there's a collection of about 70 of them, started with Smythson books and now field notes. And I actually, there's a 9-essay podcast about going through that collection. And so what I wonder is, one of the things that struck me is that in this habit, and I wonder if it's the same for you, that the notebook, this what was once revolutionary technology, is now a bulwark against the intrusions of ever-present technology, which kind of shreds our attention, disrupts our day. Do you find it has that role, A, for you, and then just more broadly in our culture at the moment?
Absolutely, 100%. For me personally, definitely. And education is kind of the crucible for a lot of these ideas, because a lot of the research into things like handwriting, the effectiveness of handwriting against the typing, for instance, is experiments carried out on students, presumably because they are, where the researchers are. And in Japan, they're very keen on this sort of thing. They've researched how much a student will retain from a lecture if they type their notes versus if they make handwritten notes. And I mean, I could go really into the weeds on this, but the short version is make handwritten notes. And if I was lecturing tomorrow, I imagine I would see a bank of open laptops in front of me, and the first thing I would do would be to explain why I would like everyone to close their laptops and take notes from my pronouncements by hand. So there is this constant little stress and strain, and I think there's lots to say about it. There's one nice thing is that Smythson, that sort of luxury notebook brand you mentioned, is a good example. You can make really beautiful notebooks. They can be lovely, and you can really gain a sense of the value of what you're doing because the object itself is so much nicer than a Lenovo laptop. That's one thing. Then you have like the amount of work your brain has to put into writing against typing, the speed you can write at against the speed you can type. These are factors. But there's one interesting trend which has just popped up over here. Now, I've got two kids. My oldest is 20 and my youngest is 12. So they've been in education over quite a long span of time. My daughter, the older one, went to, I guess what you call junior high about nearly 10 years ago. And they were all issued with iPads. And Apple were in a partnership with the school. So the school didn't pay very much for them. It was very much a test bed for having all these digital lessons where they wouldn't take notebooks to classes. They would sit and do multiple choice things on their iPads, and they would do all their presentations on their iPads. That entire generation is fantastic at PowerPoint, by the way, because they have been using PowerPoint since they were 7. And I've got to say, it was not a good experience because my daughter is, like a lot of teenagers, or she was, quite clumsy. She didn't really care about material things. We had to constantly repair broken, smashed iPads. And I, as a parent, found it really difficult to keep track of what she was studying at school. I couldn't just go to her bag and have a look at her book and see what it was she was doing because it was all buried inside the black box. Interestingly, my son, who's 8 years younger, is now at that stage of school. He's done 2 years at school with a laptop, and they've just taken the laptops away from them, and they're going back to exercise books. They're going back to handwriting. And I am sure I am not the only parent who is punching the air going, yes, this is fantastic. It is, it was worth a go. It was worth trying. But ultimately, in a learning situation, the more you involve your hands, your senses, physical things, creating something to be proud of. Because if you create something on a screen, the second you close the app or you scroll away from it, it's gone. It's just inside the machine. Whereas if you do it on paper, if you fill your exercise book with maps and pictures and drawings and poems and all of the exciting stuff which kids can do, then you end up with something to be proud of.
Well, Roland Allen, your book, The Notebook, is something to be proud of. It was just a delight to read.
Thank you so much, John. I really appreciate that.
I've really enjoyed the conversation, and we only scratched the surface of so many wonderful stories. So listeners can go off and enjoy those stories themselves. So thank you very much, Roland.
I really appreciate that, John. It's been a complete pleasure.
That's it for this month's Gabfest Reads. Cheyna Roth is the producer of the Gabfest Reads, but this episode was produced by Ethan Oberman. Ben Richmond is Senior Director of Operations for Slate Podcasts. Alicia Montgomery is Vice President of Audio for Slate. We'll be back next month with a new Gabfest Reads, and until then, Emily and David and I will be back in your podcast feed next Thursday with a new episode of the Slate Political Gabfest.